Okay, welcome back. Hopefully, you had a chance to look at the video from yesterday. We looked at student activity 14. We introduced the legacies of historical globalization in Canada. Today, we are going to continue and we're going to focus our attention more on the relationship between the First Nations people and the Canadian government and its history up until a more modern look at the relationship. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to just keep going along. For those of you that did not, I would really encourage you to go and look at the introduction video. It tells you things about the written responses and the tests and stuff like that. So just have a look at that before you continue on. But let's begin today. So again, like yesterday, I'm following through the presentation the same way that we would do this in class. So we're going to look at how has historical globalization affected the Indigenous people of Canada. So if you're in your booklet, this is page 9. So let's begin. So how has historical globalization affected the Indigenous people of Canada? Well, prior to European contact, between 500,000 to 1 million people lived in Canada at and before. There was no exact number because they weren't keeping track. We weren't having censuses counted of people, but we can estimate that there were quite a lot of people living on the continent. They were not settling. There were no cities. If we want to look at cities, we need to go to Central America and South America, where the indigenous peoples like the Aztec, the Mayans, and the Inca all created cities, and some of them actually quite large. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, had a huge population for its time. So there was some settlement building, but in Canada it was mostly hunter and gatherer societies. When you got along the coast of either British Columbia or the Maritime provinces, there was some farming and fishing as well. But in the prairies, it was mostly hunter-gatherer, and they would move their people around, basically following the food supply. So we're not seeing these settlements being built just yet. These people were massively impacted due to the European arrivals. We talked about it yesterday. We talked about the French and what they did, the English. We've been talking about diseases that the Europeans brought with them and how impactful they were. We're talking about people who have no immunity to these diseases. Diseases that the Europeans had for hundreds of years. They had built an immunity to them, and they brushed them off whenever they got them. The Indigenous people, however, had never come into contact, and we talked about this last week when we were talking about the Columbian Exchange. We're bringing domesticated animals. The Europeans are bringing domesticated animals to Canada, or at least the germs that came along with them. The Indigenous people did not keep domesticated animals prior to the European arrival. There was no cows, there was no chicken, there was no pigs, these kind of things. So these are where the diseases are coming from. So no immunity was hugely impactful on the Indigenous people of North, Central, and South America, and including the Caribbean as well. We're kind of seeing that nowadays with the spread of the coronavirus. It spreads quickly because we're not immune to it. It's brand new, and that's why it's spread so quickly. But it'll take its toll, and then we'll build immunity to it in the future. So one of the biggest impacts and effects is depopulation. So Europeans always took the best land for themselves, displacing Native Americans. So when we have the Europeans landing, the French going through the St. Lawrence, and the English landing in Newfoundland, they're taking the best land for themselves. They are trying to build for themselves a colony where it'll be beneficial. So when they can take things out and bring it back to Europe. So this caused a widespread western migration as indigenous people moved away from the coast. So if you're imagining a map, the indigenous people are forced to go farther west towards British Columbia because the good land is being taken up by the Europeans. Um, the Europeans, like we talked about yesterday, they are building fortifications. They are bringing in weapons that are making it easier for them to claim more territory. And the indigenous people are aware that these Europeans, they've brought something, we call it diseases now, that are affecting their population. So it's a matter of survival. So often displaced other groups. So if you have indigenous people in the east moving farther west, um, you're displacing other indigenous people. Um, because we have to remember that what we call Canada now was full of people, and these people had settled in these areas, and they had hunting routes and these sort of things set up, and all of a sudden people from the east are starting to be pushed farther and farther. Now the people from the east, they've had contact with the Europeans and they've done some trading, so they're bringing tools and they're bringing weapons with them, which makes it easier for them to push people off their land. Um, Remember, we talked about this yesterday as well. The divide and conquer method of the British, it would have been employed now as well to help move people west, so that more and more Europeans can come in. So we're definitely seeing a huge depopulation here. Disease, loss of land, and the fighting of coming into contact with tribes. Because remember, different First Nations tribes didn't necessarily like each other, so there was some conflict as well when they met each other. Um, Disease is the most drastic change because it was so new, and when we try to talk about total deaths, it is impossible to calculate because they were not keeping track of this. There was no markings or things written down about who was dying from what. We do see total populations being wiped out. Best example is the best. The worst best example is the people in Cuba who were completely wiped out by the Spanish diseases that came along. So it's impossible to calculate how many people actually died. Fast forward a little bit, we're going to go into Confederation, which is in 1867. Confederation is essentially when Canada became, it had more control over itself. We have a name change, so we're not talking about Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Canada, West Canada, East of Province. It's now called the Dominion of Canada. Um, so it's a restructuring. We have a prime minister now. We're still a part of the British Empire at this time, but it's a self-governing within the British Empire. So how is this going to impact the Indigenous people? We're going to pull a word from Unit 1, assimilation. So if you've forgotten what that means, I encourage you to go and look it up and to remember it, because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about assimilation. But for right now, assimilation is just bringing people into your culture, but forcing them to abandon theirs and to bring them in. So we're going to see how that takes place. So one of the first orders of the government was to create a Department of Indian Affairs. This department still exists now, by the way, and it still uses the same phrase, Indian Affairs, which if you didn't know, it's not the proper terminology to use. First Nations, Indigenous, or Aboriginal is the correct words to use to address these people. Um, Indian is not. Indian we use for people who live in India. Surprise. But that's just another effect of colonialism and Columbus's belief that he had found India when he actually discovered North and South America. Well, discovered. So, the Department of Indian Affairs. This was the government wanting to increase settlement, but they needed a branch of the government to kind of make sure that the indigenous people were taken care of to an extent. So there was a fear of American advancement west, because the American Civil War is over. They've kind of settled things there, and now they're looking to expand west. Because at this point, we're still in the 1860s, early 1870s. The Spanish are still in places like modern day Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. So they're going to continue to spread, the United States is going to spread west and fight some wars, and take these states and bring them a part of the Union. But there's also fear that they will come north, because at this point, we're only talking about Canada really going as far as where modern day Manitoba is, and then British Columbia. That whole middle ground is still up in the air. It is technically Rupert's Land. It is technically a part of the Hudson's Bay Company. But if we're talking about the United States wanting to come in, the Canadian government needs to step in and make sure that they can maintain some control over that area. So the way that they do this, it begins in the 1870s. So this is with the numbered treaties. These are agreements between the Canadian government and Indigenous tribes, and the First Nations people, for land agreements. So it began in the 1870s. Indigenous populations decreased, or declining. Sorry. Disease, loss of buffalo. So there's the diseases that they brought, and now their food source is also being impacted by Europeans as well. The Europeans are starting to attack the population of the buffalo, and it's starting to decline sharply. And what's really unfortunate is that they're not as resourceful. They don't use the entire buffalo, is what I'm trying to say. Whereas the indigenous people would use every part of it, bones, fur, everything would be used. The meat, obviously. Whereas the Europeans, it's mostly meat and, more importantly, the furs. So land was given up, and government promised reserved land for their use, annual payments, farm goods and tools, and food in times of famine. So what these treaties were is essentially, give us the land, we'll save some spots for you, and we'll make sure that you're paid annually. We'll give you tools and farming goods to help sustain you, and in times of need, we'll give you food. So in case of a famine, so it's an exchange of land for those things. We're going to see that the Europeans do what Europeans do to indigenous peoples of all over the world. Exploitation, really. So, if you're following along, we're on slide number 9. You see here a map of Canada. On this map, sorry, I have to. The numbers are kind of small. Each of these territories is a treaty. So we right now, if you look, are in Treaty 7 land. So it's the red part of southern Alberta. Each of these treaties is also, there's the date when it was signed. So each representative of that region, tribal chiefs, would have been there, and they would have signed off the agreement with the Canadian government and representatives of, including things like the Hudson's Bay Company and the British. So it was pretty. It was pretty official. And we do see something interesting too is uh, these are signed treaties. So the indigenous people are starting to use something that the Europeans had brought, the idea of treaties. So we see how that land is being divided up. So let's continue. Still on the numbered treaties, the best land was kept for settlements. If you thought that the best land would be given to the indigenous people because they're giving up their land for us the Europeans, you'd be sadly mistaken. The best land was not. It was given to the settlers. This is land along rivers, and most importantly, it will be land that will be close to the Canadian Pacific Railroad when it's built, so that the peoples can still get their goods out and bring more people in. The reserve land was less desirable. Oral tradition, used for negotiations, and then written contracts made afterwards. So, the Europeans are kind of giving a little in terms of negotiating orally, which is how the indigenous people would have been what they would have been familiar with. But the contracts need to be signed. So it's a little bit of both sides giving in. Government negotiators often left promises out of the written documents, though. So what's unfortunate is they would talk about promises and they would agree upon things verbally, but when it got written down, oh, I accidentally forgot to do that, but you signed it anyway, so sorry. These are the things that would have happened. Different opinions of what was occurring. So the government purchasing land, and the indigenous people thought this was more of a sharing thing. Because we talked about this yesterday. The indigenous people, the idea of land ownership it wasn't something that they would agree upon in the same way that Europeans do. They saw the land as a living thing that was there before them, would be there after them. So how can you own something like that? Whereas the Europeans and now the government of Canada, they were familiar with land ownership. They'd seen it in Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years. So both sides have two different mindsets on what was happening. The government had purchased land, and the indigenous people were now sharing land with the settlers. So we'll see which side wins out. Spoiler alert, it's the Canadian government. We have the Indian Act passed in 1876. This is probably one of the biggest tools used for assimilation. It's still in place today. It is still in law. It is still a part of government. It allowed strict government control of Indigenous people's lives. I may have mentioned this yesterday. I may or may not. I'm going to mention it today just to make sure. One of the things that the Indian Act did was it decided who was and who was not Indigenous. So we are all of different ethnicities. I'm Italian, you're whatever you are. For someone to come in and tell me that I am either Italian or not based on a piece of paper, that's extremely alarming. And if it happened now, I would be pretty pissed. But the Indian Act, what it is doing is actually the government is saying, based on blood percentage, how if you're Indigenous or not, and then if you're not, you lose out on those treaty rights. So this is a huge part of assimilation because it's deciding whether you're Indigenous or you're not. No government should ever have this kind of power, but the Canadian government did take this and used it and still uses it today. So it, like I said, we're going to use this structured here, defined who was a native or a status Indian. If you weren't, then you wouldn't be given the rights that a status Indian would get, which was put people in this position of being in the middle because what you would find is if you weren't enough to be considered First Nation or a status Indian, then you were in limbo, because then you weren't white enough to be a part of Canadian society, and now you've just been told that you're not enough of an Aboriginal or First Nations to be Aboriginal. So it plays a huge psychological impact as well. So if you were found to be a status Indian, you receive benefits, but regarded as a ward of the state, had to move off reserve to get the right to vote. So there was a special status, this ward of the state. Essentially, you're under state care. I'll use the word care reluctantly, because it's not really care. It's more close to just state monitoring. And one of the things that was attempted now with this more control of their lives was to ban Indigenous traditions. So the picture here on slide 12, I show this to you in class. This is what they are attempting to do with things like the Indian Act, and bringing in these numbered treaties as well. A shift from what things were to how things were going to be. We will discuss today how they attempted to quote kill the Indian and save the child through residential schools, but we'll get to that later. Actually, scratch that. We're going to get to that now. So residential schools, to further assimilation, children were forced to go to boarding schools away from their traditional homes. So they saw the older people, the adults and elderly, as sometimes being too far. To assimilate them would be a lot more difficult because they'd been living their traditional lives for so much longer. They saw the children as the key to a successful assimilation. Bringing them into this schooling, this European style schooling with English, with Christianity, it was an attempt to prop up a new generation of assimilated Indigenous people. It's important here that it says that they are away from their traditional homes. The reason that this is important is because they saw the traditional home setting as counterproductive. I'll give you an example. So let's say we have a village here and there's a residential school, or a residential school. The children go there for the school year and they return home. When they return home, they're being spoken to in their language. They are doing their tradition. They're living their traditional way of life, dressing the same. So the Canadian government and the people who run these schools see it as, well, we spent all this time trying to re-educate them. They're being taught again their old ways, so it's a waste of time. So what will happen is residential schools will keep children for the entire year, and then allow them to go back and go back and forth. So when they were there, they were not allowed to participate in their own culture. If they spoke their mother tongue, so things like Cree or Ojibwe, these sort of traditional languages, they were punished. And the punishments ranged from having to hold a boiling pot of water, to beatings, to isolation in a small room or box. These are very serious and sometimes extremely harmful to not only the physical but also to the psychological as well. There is quite a lot of literature that has been written about residential schools. I have two books here. This is Joseph Boyden's Wenjack. It is a very good read. It follows the life of a Indigenous boy named Chani Wenjack, who attempts to return home after escaping from a residential school. So this was a very good one. And I also have here Richard Wagamise's Indian Horse. Again, an also very well written book. I would encourage you to, if you ever get the chance to read one of those, or to read any other literature from this dark period in Canadian history, because these are the lives of people, and these are lives of children, some as younger than 10, some in their teens, so some even the age of you watching this right now. And it is a major part of Indigenous people's history in Canada, and one of the lasting legacies of historical globalization in Canada, because these residential schools, they lasted quite a long time. The last one closing in 1996. So that would have made me 5 years old when it was closed. So it was in my lifetime that it was they were around, and it was also your parents' lifetime as well. So with this information, you could be answering question 15. If I missed any of the other questions, at the bottom of each slide it tells you which question you can answer. So just keep in mind if I don't mention that, to please do. On slide 14, there is a video here. And you will after watching that, you can answer question 16. It's 8 minutes long, so it's not terribly long. We are now on slide 15. We have a map of residential schools of Canada. I will, in the comments, not the comment section, in the description, I will post a resource. It's a website, and it has maps, it has videos from a First Nations perspective. On the maps, it's in the top right corner. You can actually, it'll focus on Alberta. You can click on the legend, things like treaty lands, and for this case, residential schools. And it'll show you where they were in Alberta, and you can actually zoom in and it'll tell you when it was founded and when it was closed. Some of them were open for 100 years, so I mean, that is a long time. So I'll put that in the description, just because this map doesn't do a whole lot of justice. You can kind of see them, but the map that I will show you, the resource I will give you, will provide you a better look at it. But you can also look these up online as well. So again, on residential schools, we are going to, there's this point here, this bolded word, cultural genocide. I would put a star next to that one, because that is a crucial concept. Children were taught to disregard their cultures and traditions. So they were told to, don't speak your language. Don't practice your your spiritual religious beliefs. Don't dress like that. This is cultural genocide. So genocide, that term itself means to kill a people. We've seen genocides happen throughout history. The Holocaust is probably the most famous example, where there was an attempt to wipe out an entire people, the Jews. Yes, there were other people killed as well, but there's that one. Or for those of you that did this in grade 9, the Rwandan genocide, again, racially charged violence. Cultural genocide is essentially the killing part, but just to kill the culture. So the language, the beliefs, the traditions, the customs, everything. So they did not learn skills to participate in their own society, but were not welcomed into European society either. So what we're getting here is a mixture. Not a mixture, sorry. You're getting a people who are going to occupy a middle ground, where on one side, they have no connection to their traditional people. Language is gone. Traditional beliefs are gone. Dress is gone. Living style is gone. However, on the other side, they're not welcomed into the society that they were being assimilated into. Language, yes, they can speak English, but you're too Aboriginal to be welcomed. Yes, you dress the same, but again, you're too Aboriginal to be welcomed into white European society. This is a fact. Now we have this middle ground where you don't know where you belong, and we do start to see this is where the mental health and the mental state of the First Nations people is broken, because this traditional sense of belonging is gone. They occupy this middle abyss of nothingness, and we see that, and we can even see that today. You don't need to know this or anything, but this word intergenerational trauma stems from this living in this void, in this middle ground, because the people here in this middle ground, they grow up and they have children, and then their children are also in limbo between two sides, and then it progresses on, and then it has a damaging effect on mental health, which is very serious. It's a plague on all people, but this is a very much man-made creation of this attack on mental health. And like I said before, the last residential school was not closed until 1996, so we're not talking too long ago here. So it is very serious, and there is a lot of literature. There are many survivor stories on YouTube. You can watch them. I will post in the description some more links to different things, just different stories that you could get a better understanding. Some of them you may be familiar with, some of them you may have studied, but just to understand that when we talk about historical globalization and the legacy of it in Canada, residential schools and the treatment of the Aboriginal people of this land, this is the legacy, and it is not a very positive legacy as well. So last slide here, slide 17. There's an 8-minute video here of the federal apology for the residential schools done by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So you'll answer questions 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22 after this video. So that is all for today. Again, if you are just watching this video, go back and watch yesterday's and also the introduction as well to know things. If you have any questions, write them in the comment section or email me directly, and I will answer them as best I can. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you tomorrow.